Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. My name is Skip Rutherford. I'm the Dean of the Clinton School, and we are glad to have you at another of our great speaker series that Nikolai DePickle leads and organizes. I had the opportunity to spend some time with Ambassador Hill last night, and let me tell you, he knows his stuff, and you all be ready to fire good questions at him. We're fortunate to have you. Could I please ask, except for those that will be tweeting, if you would silence your cell phones? That would be helpful for our television production. To introduce our speaker is Clinton School student Kelley, who is from the metropolis of Lonsdale, Arkansas. Being from Batesville, Arkansas, I understand metropolises. He is a graduate of Arkansas Tech University, but he spent 8 years with the United States Marine Corps, serving tours of duty both in Afghanistan and Iraq. And probably of all the students at the Clinton School, I would say, if not at the top in this category, he's close. At his young age, he's already been to 45 of the world's countries. I don't know about you, but is there anybody in this room that's been to 45 countries besides Kelley? One, two. And with the highest respect to people our age, we're a little bit older than that. But it's a remarkable achievement, and it shows his interest in international relations and in diplomacy. At the Clinton School, he's working on a very interesting team-based project with the Farm and Food Innovation Center at the St. Joseph's Orphanage in North Little Rock, working to expand the local food supply. And it's a very exciting and a very challenging project. But today we're as much, I guess we could in that area, but we're here to talk about the world, Iraq, Iran, Korea, and with a gentleman who knows it very well. So to introduce our speaker, please welcome Clinton School student Kelley.
Thank you, Dean Rutherford, for that introduction there. In 1995, while today's guest speaker was U.S. Ambassador to Macedonia, working with Ambassador Holbrooke on the Dayton Accords in the Balkans, I began my own personal journey toward building bridges between parties of opposition. From resolving disputes in middle school and high school, to serving in Afghanistan and Iraq during Operation Enduring Freedom, I found a passion for making connections with others and working on disparate sides of various disputes, working to find peaceful solutions while still preparing a defense. A hard lesson I learned early on is one mentioned in Ambassador Hill's memoir, and I'm paraphrasing here. While diplomacy doesn't work everywhere or in every situation, it's hard to understand what the alternative is. It's a concerted effort to keep working at an issue, and ultimately it is work never completed. It is vitally important but frequently hidden work that is at times dangerous, decisive, and divisive, yet filled with colorful personalities, exotic locations, and cultural significance. International diplomacy, especially U.S. global relations, is an often derided field, earning both ire and jeers alike. Sayings such as, "Diplomacy is the art of letting someone else have your own way," or that it's the art of saying, "nice doggy," until you can find a rock. Sayings like that malign the field and detract from the very real magic that's constantly being worked by those in the Foreign Service. Ambassador Hill has worked in international affairs for over 3 decades, has served under the last 6 U.S. presidents, and currently serves as the Dean of the Joseph Corbeau School of International Studies at the University of Denver. During his career, he has earned numerous awards, such as the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award, the Robert S. Frazier Award for Peace Negotiations, and parallel to our own local ethos, the Building Bridges Award by the Pacific Century Institute. Whether showing solidarity with a Japanese delegation by donning a Daisuke Matsuzaka ball cap, by donning a Cebu Lions ball cap and discussing the signing of Daisuke Matsuzaka to his beloved team, the Boston Red Sox, making sincere small talk with hotel staff abroad, or with being the only delegate during negotiations to freely speak with media at least twice daily. He has sought to find common ground and made concerted efforts to understand all sides of a dispute throughout his career. Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to introduce you all to our esteemed guest, Ambassador Christopher Hill.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Kerry, and thank you for your service to Iraq and Afghanistan. It is a real pleasure to be here in Little Rock for the first time. I've heard a lot about it, what with having served in the Clinton administration, and it just seemed they should have moved the capital from Washington to Little Rock. I think, so it's a pleasure to finally get here. Pleasure to have this wonderful tour of the Clinton Library. I found my name in a couple of spots there under, if you can find his daily schedule for every day he was president, and if you remember what day you were over at the White House, you can find your name listed as a note taker. So there I was. But maybe more poignantly, there's a picture there of the Bosnian team, and we're going out to sort of engage with the Bosnians, the Serbs, the Croats, and we had just lost several members of our team in a kind of nasty accident that took place high above Sarajevo, a place called Mount Igman. And so we brought the bodies back, buried them, and this picture is in the chapel at Fort Myers, just outside Washington. It's of President Clinton giving us our instructions as we're standing there listening to, his view of what we need to do now that we've reconstituted the team and we're prepared to go out. And I describe a lot of this in my book because I think it's important for people to understand that this diplomacy, foreign policy is very much of a human game. I mean, you're really working with other people. It's all about teamwork. It's all about working with others. So it's so to see some of these scenes in this museum really brought back memories. What I thought I would do during the half hour I have is maybe talk a little about some of the foreign policy challenges, and then engage in the very crass business I've learned to accept that this is what I got to do, of selling my book, which I think is on sale. There it is, right over there, on sale for very good price, right? I mean, on a per-page basis, it's an incredible price. I should say in government, you never write, or I never wrote anything more than a 2-page memo, and in government, no one even reads page 2, and so. I remember getting on to page 3 and telling my wife, Julie, I'm on page 3 now. Never been here before. And then sort of like that scene in Forrest Gump, I just kept going, and finally on page 403, I stopped. So, but it was quite an adventure to recreate in my mind these events, and then really to see that even today, we're on this year is the 20th anniversary of the Dayton Peace Accords, where a lot of these issues are still out there. Some are better than they were, some are frankly worse than they were. I would put Iraq in that category, but I think all need to be continue to be worked on by by this president and by the next president as well. A few years ago, or actually in the 1950s, there was a Polish party first secretary named Władysław Gomułka. Władysław Gomułka is a name probably lost to history. And Władysław Gomułka, the leader of Poland at the time, was known for very long speeches and not particularly successful metaphors. And One day he stood in front of a large crowd in the southern Polish city of Krakow and said, "Comrades, just a few years ago, our nation stood on the very edge of a deep abyss, and I'm here to tell you today, comrades, we've taken an important step forward." And so I think it's really important that as you look at some of these problems that really took you to the edge a few years ago, don't take that important step forward. Take a step back and kind of figure out what we need to do and what the challenges are. Certainly, I think the Obama administration has its hands full today. There is the challenge of dealing with the fact that Iraq, I mean, if you spend 5 minutes in Iraq, you will be convinced that taking Saddam Hussein off the board was a very good day. I mean, to see what he did to that country, to see what he did to those people, you will think, glad we did that. But at the same time, you'll see the complexity of that country and the fact that we went into it really not understanding it. We did not, for example, understand the centrality of the fault line, if you will, between the Shia world and the Sunni world. We saw the fault line of dictatorship and democracy, but we didn't see the real fault line that we were going to then excite and create these great difficulties that country is having. We brought democracy, more or less. And democracy always has to be looked at as not of a state of being, but more of a direction. Are you getting more democratic? Are you getting less democratic? So we kind of pointed the country in a more democratic direction, and yet when you look at how elections have gone in Iraq, you can see that the organizing political identity in that country is not whether you believe in freedom or whether you believe in dictatorship. The organizing political identity in that country is whether you're a Shia or Sunni. I mean, I wish it were things like whether you believe in big government or small government, or more social programs or less social programs. I wish it were that kind of thing where people have some opportunity to kind of shift between them and change their minds after a few years. But in fact, it's between these two sects, if you will, of the of Islam, Shia and Sunni. And so, for the first time in many centuries, the U.S. in effect installed a Shia government in Iraq. Iraq had been ruled by various forms of Sunnis for centuries. And the Sunnis are the majority, by far the majority in the Arab world. I mean, it goes all the way to, all the way through North Africa. Every single Arab country, let's put aside Syria for a second, is Sunni-led. And so we, in effect, created the only Shia-led Arab country. Well, lo and behold, not every other Sunni country was enthused about this. I would say no Sunni country was enthused about this. And that is the problem with trying to manage Iraq as a democracy, because it's going to be Shia-led as long as the Sunnis are only some 20% of the population there. The Sunnis are not going to rule a democratic Iraq. Now, what we, of course, hoped for was that the Shia in Iraq would rule the way the Nelson Mandela ruled in South Africa. Nelson Mandela understood that the white South Africans had ruled South Africa for decades, if not centuries, and so Nelson Mandela understood the need to reach out to the white South African population and make sure they felt a part of the new system. Well, instead, we got a prime minister named Nouri al-Maliki. And Nouri al-Maliki, as I like to say, if he ever had charisma, it cleared up a long time ago, because he was not a fun guy to deal with, and was not a person who really necessarily was attractive to people to say, I'm going to follow him even though I'm a Sunni and he's a Shia. So Maliki was a very, very tough customer. He did not understand this outreach issue. He, I think, alienated even more Sunnis than were already alienated by the entire process. And so as Syria blew up, and as we saw many of these Sunni groups that had become insurgencies in Iraq, who essentially had to flee Iraq when the United States and frankly, the government in Baghdad were successful in turning a lot of these Sunni-led tribal leaders, Sunni tribal leaders in Western Iraq against some of these Al-Qaeda types in Anbar and other places in Western Iraq. Now they are back. The Sunni tribal leaders have kind of had it with Maliki. I don't think Haidar al-Abadi's ascendancy is really going to change much for them. And so I think we have a real problem in Iraq, and it's not going to be a problem that's easy to solve. I think the effort to try to allow the Iraqis to create a strong central government, as we encouraged them to do, was wrong-headed. I think there should have been much more effort at local autonomy, a kind of different constitution that really understood the heterogeneity of this country. And so I think they have to get there, but how they get there and whether they can get there still all living in one country, the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shia, I think is going to be a real challenge for Iraq. Certainly, ISIS is a group that there is, frankly, in my view, no room for diplomacy with. I don't think these are people that we can reason with. I don't think these are people that we can somehow turn. You know, what we did in Iraq and Western Iraq was we'd show people money. You know, I know it's a shocking thing to know that money plays in diplomacy. And so we would say, okay, Sheikh, here's some money, but no more shooting at our troops. I don't think that kind of process is sort of available to us with ISIS. I think there's a huge scope for diplomacy in the ISIS crisis, but not so much with ISIS as the diplomacy needs to be applied to countries that from where there has been a lot of support for ISIS, countries in the Gulf states, countries in the Arab Peninsula, where a lot of the support, the financial support for ISIS has come. So I think we need to be very active with these countries and do our best to try to cut off supplies for ISIS. I think eventually, you know, there's some, I think, room for optimism that ISIS has, the momentum of ISIS in Western Iraq has been very much blunted. I think the ISIS is and there's some evidence to suggest that they're retreating back to Syria and that they probably won't be able to be successful in Iraq. But if our project in Iraq is to be successful, it's not just eliminating or driving out this virulently bloodthirsty, really, groups as ISIS. It's in helping the Iraqis, or at least giving a helping hand when they ask for it, for the Iraqis to form a system of governance that makes Kurds, Sunnis, and Shia all feel they can live together. And that is still, I think, a very difficult proposition. I think, though, turning to Syria, you know, for many Americans, they looked at the Arab Spring, or whatever we want to call it today. We'll call it the Arab thing at this point. But they looked to that process some years ago and they thought, oh, finally, Arabs, is this awakening. People are saying enough of these corrupt governments, we're going to sweep them away, introduce more transparent democratic systems. Again, I submit to you, this was a kind of mirror imaging of the problems in that part of the world, as if they are motivated by the same things that would motivate us were we in such circumstances. Yes, we want more transparency. Yes, we'd want more freedoms. I submit to you, though, there are other things going on, and I submit to you that it was very sort of heterogeneous there. You had different situations in different countries. I think within Syria, you have a situation that is curiously similar to Iraq, except that whereas in Iraq the Sunnis are 20%, the Sunni Arabs are 20% minority, in Syria the Sunni Arabs are a 60% majority. And so you can see that the lines that were drawn between Iraq and Syria were probably not drawn on sectarian or ethnographic basis. If Sykes-Picot, if those two British and French diplomats were alive today, I think they'd have some splaining to do on this, because I don't think they had a clue what they were essentially dividing up. And so Syria, I think it's fair to say, and I think the history books will be very clear, as soon as the Arab Spring broke out, in Syria you had the people brought out or began a sectarian knife fight that has simply shown no signs of abating. I think the United States made a mistake in Syria. And the mistake is not that we somehow didn't jump into it or, take that step into the abyss. The mistake is that we immediately assumed it was somehow akin to the issues that were already going on in the Maghreb in northern North Africa or in Egypt. So whereas the Obama administration was accused of being too slow in getting rid of Mubarak, and by the way, when someone has kind of helped you out for 30 years, I don't think one should be the first to push him under the bus. That's a personal opinion. It was quite clear that Mubarak had outlived his shelf life with the Egyptian people. It was pretty clear that his government was on those indexes of corruption and things like that were going in the wrong direction. Nonetheless, I think it was appropriate for us not to be the first to push him under the bus. So, as if to compensate for our slowness in reacting to Mubarak, remember we were trying to argue that Mubarak should stay and be there when they conducted a new election, whereas the Egyptian people were saying, we want him out today. So I think there was a feeling we could compensate by being a little too quick to tell Bashar al-Assad that it's time to go. And so very early on, in the Syrian uprising, the U.S. took the position that Assad should leave. Well, Assad is certainly not on my Christmas list, and probably wouldn't have been on yours either. He's very, he comes from a family that has killed a person or two. It is not a very nice regime in the least, but when you're calling for someone to leave, there has to be some concept of who it is you think ought to come in after that person, unless you're quite willing to accept chaos. And I submit to you that there are very few circumstances, there are circumstances, but few circumstances in which chaos is preferable to someone, to an identifiable leader. So in saying that Assad had to go, we thought maybe we could further isolate him, push him into the corner, embolden the opposition, and before you know it, he'd be gone, and we'd look very prescient in saying he's got to go, and lo and behold, he's gone. The trouble was, I think it did more to isolate us than it did to isolate Assad, and I think we have paid for that ever since. First of all, by isolating him and saying we're not going to deal with his regime, otherwise known as the Alawite regime, which is a sort of tribal identification, less than 20% of Syrians, maybe even only 15% of Syrians, that we by isolating him, we then basically threw our lot with the opposition. And too often, many of our journalists and others thought that the opposition would be, these people who wanted democracy. And I think it has now been pretty clear that much of the opposition, at least the military opposition in the field, as opposed to the cafes in London, but the battlefields in Syria, that military opposition to Assad was in the form of groups like al-Nusra, and now the Islamic State forces. In short, these are not people that we should necessarily be supporting, and yet they comprise the main body of this opposition. There are those, of course, who say that, well, we should help support a moderate opposition. I love moderates. I wish we had more of them in our country. But just as we sometimes have trouble finding moderates in our country, believe me, it's even more difficult finding them in Syria. And so I'm, frankly speaking, a little skeptical that training 5,000 moderates that they are going to first defeat al-Nusra, second defeat al-Nusra, which is the al-Qaeda affiliate in this war, secondly defeat ISIS, thirdly go on to defeat the Bashar al-Assad's forces, who, by the way, were reinforced by some Iranian help as well as Hezbollah help. And then what? I guess they're going to figure out how to have a victory parade into Damascus. In short, I think it's kind of a long shot. And I would like to see the U.S. spend a little more time, not so much on talking about what weapons we can bring to the battlefield, but rather talking about what we would like to see Syria become in the future. Because wars do end. Wars do end. And at the end of a war, you have to have some system of governance. And I don't think the United States has kind of stepped up and said what it is we even want to see in Syria. We talk about provisional elections for provisional government that'll draw up a provisional constitution that will be some sort of provisional interim authority in Syria. Well, I submit to you that most people will not climb out of their foxholes and end the war on the basis of creating such provisional structures. I don't think it's really going to work. And so what I would like us to do is maybe reach back 20 years and remember what happened in Bosnia. You know, people often say that what happened in Bosnia was a courageous effort to create a peace process in a U.S. air base in Dayton, Ohio, known as Wright-Patterson Air Base. And no question that was important. But what was much more important than all that work in Dayton was what went on a year and a half before. And what went on a year and a half before was something called the contact group, consisting of Russia. And I always think it's nice when you can figure out a way to bring Russia into some of these things. Russia, France, Germany, the UN, Italy got involved, the US, of course, and in Germany. And we managed to create on 2 pages what Bosnia should look like in the future when the war ends. Bosnia shall consist of 2 entities. The one entity shall be 51% of the territory, that is the Bosnian Croat Federation. The other entity, the Serb entity, would be 49%. There should be a collective presidency that has rotating representation of Serbs, Croats, and Bosnian Muslims at the time, now called Bosniaks. There should be a parliament that also unites Bosnia together. There should have regional parliaments in the Federation area and the Bosnian Serb area. So when this stuff came out in the late spring of 1994, people kind of laughed at it. I mean, if you looked at a map of Bosnia, you could see in the maps we had in the State Department, it was a sort of pinkish color, and that was where the Serbs were, in a yellow color, and that's where the Bosnian Croat Federation was, and there was a lot of pink in that map. It was something like 80% Serb. So everyone laughed at this contact group plan, but eventually, as people as the war stalemated and people really didn't know what to do, suddenly people got behind this plan. So I support the contact group plan. And so eventually, as we gave some weapons to some people, and by the way, the Bosnians got weapons from Iran. This was not always a pretty picture, I might add. But eventually, they had a territorial division that was much closer to the contact group plan, and that's when the Dayton Peace Accords began, and we essentially implemented the contact group plan. 2 pages of sort of general principles is not an implementation plan. Implementation is where that's where you get to your 1 to 15,000 maps, where you have to kind of figure out zones of separation, a lot of things like that. That's how you figure out how you needed to build some kind of constitutional structure. But we had a basic plan. And I think this is what is sadly lacking in the entire Syria issue. I mention all this because it's not that Syria is the most important place in the world. I don't know what is, but it's probably not Syria. But I think it should trouble our consciences, all of us, that as we sit here in this peaceful confines of this presidential library, some 200 and counting, 200,000 people have been killed in Syria, and there's no end in sight. And I think the only way to end this is to have a plan going forward. If you have rejectionists who absolutely refuse the plan, that's when military force can be applied, that is to people who reject a political deal. But when there's no political deal, how can you blame anybody for rejecting what? What are they rejecting? There's no deal out on the table. So I think we need more of this kind of American leadership in diplomacy. I mean, to be sure, what our troops did in Bosnia, when they went in, they implemented a political arrangement. There's a reason why we never had a single casualty among our U.S. troops, our hostile casualty in Bosnia. It's because everyone accepted the plan, and so we went in to enforce the plan, and it went very well. I think we need that in Syria, and we need it soon. I think part of what happened here was our president announced something called the pivot. I think it's very important to spend more time on East Asia. I was the assistant secretary for East Asia. You did have the sense that, why are we so wrapped up in places in the Middle East and not doing enough about, relationships in places like Indonesia. Indonesia has some 240 million people. Why aren't we more engaged in a place like that? China has 1.4 billion people. Some of these Balkan countries that I dealt with, they could fit in a Beijing city bus. I mean, this was quite a, we need to be more involved with East Asia. But I think, as with any sort of major muscle move in diplomacy, it is kind of fraught with unintended consequences. I mean, even minor muscle moves in diplomacy are fraught with unintended consequence. Remember the story in 1815 at the Congress of Vienna where the Russian ambassador slumped over and died of a heart attack, and the French ambassador said, "Why did he do that?" So people always will question your motivations, and so when you consider, this motivation of moving from to the Pacific as the pivot envisioned, it was fraught with unintended consequences. The first being that we didn't care anymore about the Middle East, and I think we're paying that price. The second being that we didn't really care that much about the Atlantic relationship. And with due respect to Europeans in the room, they're upset when we care, but they're really upset when they think we don't care. And so I think that created a lot of misconception. And finally, as we go to Asia, it became a kind of exercise, not so much in engaging ourselves in this fascinating and positive part in the world, but it became an exercise in appearing that we want to somehow constrain China. And I submit to you that China is about as big and complex place as you'll ever see in the world. And it behooves us to figure out a way to deal with China and not just to look at China from the point of view of the confrontation that many people believe surely will come. There's a lot of talk about how China, this is a case of the rising power, China, the established power of the United States, and the inevitability of conflict between a rising power and established power. And people who could not spell Thucydides have brought out Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian Wars as proof that somehow this is some kind of inevitability. I submit to you there are a few differences between contemporary China and ancient Athens, or contemporary United States and ancient Sparta, that you might want to consider before assuming that this is a grim replay of the 30 years Peloponnesian Wars. In short, we need to develop patterns of cooperation with China. We need to find ways to work with China. I think I would suggest that the first place we ought to work with China is, first of all, we need to establish priorities, what's important to us. I think priorities, whenever someone can explain priorities, it's something you can work with. And when someone says everything is a priority, you can assume that nothing's a priority. So I would start with a priority of doing something about North Korea's nuclear aspirations. Certainly, to some extent, this is a triumph of hope over experience, because so far the Chinese have not done a lot. But I would suggest to you that China is changing in its views toward North Korea. There is an understanding in China that the relationship with North Korea is from its past, and the relationship with the U.S. and the rest of the world is in its future. And while China has a lot of nasty maritime disputes with its neighbors, by the way, maritime disputes, the blame for which I think one can rest with the Chinese. I think the Chinese have been very clumsy in how they've handled some of these relationships. Nonetheless, I mean, that is not what makes China's relations with the rest of us so problematic. After all, everybody, except for, the Czech Republic or someone has maritime problems. I think what makes China's foreign policy so difficult for so many people is the implicit support for North Korea, which has certainly has one of the worst, if not the worst, human rights records in the world. Now we know they also seem to launch cyber attacks. By the way, I saw the movie. It wasn't my favorite movie in the world, but not so much as a solidarity with Sony Corporation, as a solidarity in my view that the North Koreans could do no right. I watched it anyway, and it was not bad. So North Korea is engaged in all kinds of things, and I think it's time to really work with the Chinese, because this accident of the 20th century, which is just a scar on the Korean Peninsula, and frankly, a division of people who had the Koreans were not responsible for their division. This is not Germany. People always say, well, this is just like Germany. No, it isn't. Korea did not start World War II. And so I think it behooves us to work with China and to set the priority of finding patterns of cooperation such that the Chinese can understand that they should be very happy if there's a united Korean Peninsula with the Republic of Korea as its neighbor. So I think there are a lot of issues like that will keep diplomats very busy for years to come. What I wanted to do in my book, though, was to kind of show how from the point of view of a foreign service officer, sort of out there in the in these embassies, and how you really have to kind of do things, and at times do things without guidance. One of my mentors, actually one of my mentors and my tormentors, Richard Holbrooke, would say to me, the only thing worse than not having guidance is to have guidance. And he was quite right, because sometimes you get this stuff from Washington, go, what am I supposed to do with this? I can crumple it up and throw it at them, but that's about it. So I think it's, I wanted people to see what it's sort of like out there, working in the U.S., working for the U.S., trying to get some stuff done, trying to do things in a where things, you can't wait for help. I have one section called Calling an Audible, where I had to decide whether or not to meet the North Koreans and not wait for any guidance from anyone. I feel there are too many of these sort of Washington books where there's this kind of score settling going on. And so I really said, I'm not going to do that. I did make an exception for our former vice president, because in his book, which you can check out of your local library, but please don't buy it. He has a chapter devoted to what terrible people Condoleezza Rice and I are. I mean, and he sort of goes on, and I'm thinking, when I read it, and then I reshelved it on the bottom shelf with the spine in, when you're an author, you learn tricks like that. My wife actually took my book and put it on the bestseller thing at the airport in Denver, and it sold within 30 minutes. So we monitored it from the McDonald's across the way there. I said, God, someone's buying it, Julie. Do it again. Where was I? Anyway, I think so. My feeling is, if Cheney had such a problem with us negotiating with the North Koreans, he could have, walked a few feet and gone into the president's office and said, Mr. President, I got a real problem with what Secretary Rice and, what's his name are doing on North Korea. And, they would have been the end of it. But to wait 4 years to do a memoir, I thought it was in rather bad taste, so I just thought I'd follow suit. So that's the only kind of nasty stuff there. I wanted it to be, I want people to understand the nature of sort of the team sport of diplomacy. So there'll be a lot of names that you don't necessarily have to remember. They're colleagues of mine, but I want you to see how, some people who are very junior Foreign Service officers can make some real contributions. I think it's important, too, for people to understand that the Foreign Service, becoming an ambassador is not the entry-level position. I mean, becoming an ambassador is what you do after many years of schlepping people's luggage in from the airport and doing other things. And so I want people to understand that even in those junior positions, you can be called upon to do important things and to really think on your feet and make a contribution. And so I pick up the story very early on, actually, when my dad was in the Foreign Service, and I pick up the story when I was some 7 years old and finding our house had been trashed in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. I came back from school, and all the windows were broken, and I didn't know what had happened. There were all this nasty graffiti all over the road, and I came up to the house, and my mother simply opened the door and said, Chris, you won't be playing outdoors today, and then explained to me that it was when a Congolese leader named Lumumba was killed, and these leftist students in Yugoslavia went and trashed the first American's house that they knew, and so ours was that house. And, we weren't evacuated. There was nothing in the news about it. We went off to school the next day, and sort of life went on in the Hill family. But I want people to see that, this stuff has been going on for a lot longer than we know collectively. I spent a lot of time in the Balkans. Not that everyone really needs to remember names like Srebrenica and things like that. But I think people do need to understand that wars don't always start in the center. They don't always start in important places. They often start in the scruffy edges. And if they're not taken care of in those scruffy edges, they can cause sort of deep problems in the center. For example, there's no question that the human rights violations going on in the Balkans were a major reason why our country got involved with the Balkans. But at the same time, I think it's important for people to understand that another reason we got involved is our relationships with those European countries were really going very badly as we sat in Washington accusing the British and French of giving in to genocidal policies on the part of Milosevic, and the British and the French would say, well, that's easy for you to say, Americans. You don't have any troops here. We have troops here, so we don't need your advice as long as we have troops here and you don't. And so this was very corrosive. And so the idea that you can criticize others for the job they're doing, but then not do any of the job yourself is kind of hard to take. And I think we were really in a very bad way with the Europeans, and I think we ended up in a better place thanks to working together with them in the Balkans. I spent a lot of time explaining these North Korea talks. Again, not that North Korea is necessarily the most important country in the world, whatever whatever they think. But to understand how to try to get other countries to work together on things, and also the fact that a lot of diplomacy, it's not always what the press thinks it's about. Of course it was about trying to disarm the North Koreans, but as I said earlier, it's also about trying to get the U.S. and South Koreans back into formation and working together on things and showing the mutual respect that has been such a hallmark of our 50 years. So a lot of things had to be fixed in that. And then finally, I wanted to write a book that is accessible to anyone with a sense of humor. I just think it's important to understand that you can't go grim-faced through everything. You can't be Bill Belichick on all of these things. You have to kind of lighten up at times. And I'm from New England, so we're having a little problem today, but we'll get through it. So you have to kind of lighten up, and I think we managed to do that throughout the book. And so I have often told people that a sense of humor is, it can be a really constant companion, and it needs to come out in the toughest of times. So with those comments, maybe we can open up to a more interactive portion, and then sign some books.
I was just hoping you'd give us your thoughts on Yemen. It's been central to the administration's strategy to combat Islamic terrorism, and then there were some big events that happened there yesterday, and and I think it furthers the divide between Sunnis and Shia. Yeah,
it's another divide of Sunnis and Shia, and of course within the Sunni community it has substantial al-Qaeda forces, which we have been fortunate enough to work with the last two Sunni-led Yemeni governments against al-Qaeda. But now that government, as we've seen in the last 2 days, has been literally under siege. I think the president's residential palace was actually taken, and I think he's been hiding out in the center of town, and I doubt for long. So what's going to be interesting is whether the Saudis just stand by and watch this. The Saudis, one of the reasons they're so concerned about Shia-led Iraq is they worry about Shia population in their own East Province. And if the Shia, because of Iraq, gain a kind of political expression to their identity as Shia, they're Shia. Shia are like 80% of Bahrain. They're about, 40% in Kuwait. They're big, and I think they're in the sort of 40 or 30% in Yemen, if I'm not mistaken. But clearly they are on a path that might have them taking power, and are the Saudis going to be indifferent to that? So I think this is going to be a real setback for our al-Qaeda anti-al-Qaeda efforts, because I think we're going to see this Shia-Sunni divide, which is something we haven't really been able to address in Yemen, and we're going to see that fester, and I think we're going to have a lot of talks with the Saudis about how that proceeds. I mean, to understand Yemen is to understand a country whose tribes sat in those mountains for centuries, and as people went to the holy places, they'd prey upon those pilgrims and rob them. I mean, I don't mean to suggest that Yemeni national identity has to do with thievery of pilgrims, but there's an element of that. It's not such a great historical endowment. As you know, they split up into North and South, which was also tribal and sectarian. They put together the government for a time, but during these times of great, sort of religious fervor frankly, all over the world, but especially in the Middle East, I think they're having trouble holding that together.
Mr. Coker, right back here at the back.
Can you comment on the diplomatic team that currently advises President Obama? Are these some of your colleagues from the past? Are they career people? Do they share any of your views? If they were standing here today, relative to your comments, where would they be?
You know, once a diplomat, always a diplomat. Well, no, they tend to be political appointees. I would say for the first time, and I'm trying to think if there was another time, there must have been, but I cannot think of one, the top 3 positions in the State Department are political. Top 4 positions now are political and not Foreign Service officers. The White House, the National Security Council staff is probably the biggest it's ever been. It's 3 times or so larger than it was during the Clinton administration and also during the Bush administration. The usual pattern is presidents come in and they say they want to get the National Security Council smaller than their predecessor, and then over the course of the years there's a drift upward. In this case, our president, I think, very much wanted to have foreign policy kind of centralized in the White House. So from the Bush period, they went up, and it continues to be very big. There are a lot of Foreign Service officers, my colleagues, in that, but the leadership under Susan Rice, these are not political people. I mean, I know Susan Rice, but she's a political. I mean, you know, she's a political party person. So the UN ambassador, very political. No sign of any career Foreign Service officers anywhere near the top echelons of that operation. I would say it's more political today than it's ever been. Again, I'm hesitating simply because I don't have the data to support that, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. Do I think that's the right way to go? No. No, I don't. And I really worry about it, frankly speaking. You know, some of these ambassadors who were, you know, on these YouTube comedies, you know, this woman going to Hungary, this hotel guy going to Norway or something. I mean, these are people who to me, didn't even crack their briefing book, let alone, you know, prepare themselves for those positions. You know, the military figured this out a long time ago. Remember in the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, General, was it Sickle? I can't remember. He moves ahead in the left center of the Union lines. He's way out of position. Stonewall Jackson is basically able to carve him up in the early part of the second day. And so the military figured out early on, we don't want political generals. And you know, some of these generals in the Northern Army were, and the South as well, 150 years ago. But Foreign Service, you know, it's more political by the day, I think. And too often you're seeing people who, you know, the assumption is that anybody can be an ambassador. And remember, the test seemed to be in some of those hearings that were on YouTube. Well, the person hasn't visited the country. Well, so what? I mean, that's the least of it. I mean, the real issue is whether that person knows anything about the country. I mean, and so, or understands the business. And so I really, I think we have a problem, and but I don't see any effort, either Republican or Democrat, to fix it in the future.
Yes.
Thank you. Early on in your talk, you said something that I really can't comprehend, which is that nothing personal, but that when we went into Iraq, we didn't understand the animosity between the Shia and the Sunnis. Yeah. There was a terrible, horrible war that went on for 10 years or more between the Iraqi Sunnis and the Persian Shias in Iran. Terrible, a horrible thing. How could we go into Iraq not knowing that these two people didn't like each other?
Well, I mean, we certainly understood that Saddam and the Ayatollah didn't like each other. We certainly understood the Iraq-Iran relationship. if you look, and I spent some time looking at this, I was as shocked as you are about that. So I asked actually to pull up a lot of the CIA studies on, what problems we're likely to uncover in Iraq. And there was an incredible amount of discussion about the Ba'athist Party, such that so the Ba'athist Party was described as a sort of Iraqi version of the Nazi Party, that we had to, upon taking over Iraq, we had to engage in a de-Ba'athification process similar to the denazification process in post-war Germany. I looked through a lot of this literature because of your question, and I was very surprised that the people writing this never kind of paused to say, actually, the Ba'athist Party in Iraq was mainly a Sunni party, and that any anti-Ba'athism, any de-Ba'athification would likely be perceived, as it turned out to be, as de-Sunnification. And that was, if you look for areas where the Shia and Sunni communities agreed on something, that was one, where the Sunnis felt that we had gone in there and cleared all the Sunnis out, and the Shia felt that we had gone in there and cleared all the Sunnis out. So I don't think we understood it. I don't think we understood the centrality of it, and I think it was because Saddam was discussed as such a hideous dictator, which he was, that we kind of took a secular overlay to all this and thought this was about dictatorship and people who wanted to get out from under dictatorship. Plus, many Sunnis in Iraq, and to this day, they'll say things like, well, we had nothing to do with Saddam. He was a dictator. Of course, we didn't like him either. Well, I understand why they say that. They don't want to say that Saddam was, their contribution to Iraqi governance. I understand that. But at the same time, Saddam, if you look at who had senior positions in that structure, they're all Sunnis. A few so-called Shia, secular Shia. But secular Shia is a term you ought to be careful about, because it's often people who barely know that they're Shia. So Saddam was a secularist. He was not a deep tribal or deep sectarian. I mean, later on, he would appear in tribal outfits and things like that. But he was a secularist. So I guess I can understand why people kind of bought that. Believe what he was saying about that. But frankly, if you look at the how his government was staffed, they were Sunnis, and I think it was a big mistake on our part.
Well, there are a lot of more questions, and I hope that you will ask them individually when you stop by and visit with him as you look at this book. Walter Isaacson, the author of Steve Jobs, says this is how diplomacy really works. It involves danger, hard choices, and colorful personalities playing high-stakes games. Christopher Hill is a master at both negotiations and storytelling. Ambassador Hill, welcome to the Clinton School.
Thank you very much. Thank you.